This clip is a sneak peek from one of our Patterns Plus video series. If you'd like to see the full video and more videos like it, please consider subscribing via the link in the description. Patterns Plus gives access to exciting new video series we are working on. These include special scholarly interviews on various biblical archaeology topics and evidences. Your subscription goes towards supporting our work on new Patterns of Evidence films and other Bible-affirming projects that help preserve and pass on the historical credibility of the Bible. Thank you so much for your support, and please consider coming alongside us in this important mission. Not every view expressed by scholars contributing to podcast content necessarily reflects the views of Patterns of Evidence. We include perspectives from various sides of debates on biblical matters so that our audience can become familiar with the different arguments involved. Keep thinking.
Hello, thinkers. We have an exciting new set of episodes for you as we continue the series, Searching for Sodom and Gomorrah. Many of you have asked if we knew about Dr. Stephen Collins, and of course I've known about him for a number of years, and he is our guest today. We're very excited to have him, and he's been working in the Jordan Valley at a site called el-Hammam. And he's written a book called Discovering the City of Sodom. Well, Dr. Collins, one of the things I've just thought about here was so many people are interested in archaeology, and how in the world did you become interested in the Bible and archaeology?
I grew up in a Christian home, so I did Bible all of my life, and but I did go on in college and major in anthropology and archaeology, not necessarily Near East archaeology, but I had a really good friend later who was an archaeologist who drugged me over to Israel and Jordan and Egypt. He said, now you need to be focusing over here. You know, all that archaeology over there, that very late stuff that you're doing in the United States, you need to take that focus away and you need to come over here. And I thought, well, it's a great idea. Well, he drugged me over there, and that was the end of that. I mean, that was the change of my life. And so even though I'm first of all, a Bible guy, I've taught Hebrew, I've taught Greek, I did a lot of linguistics, so that's kind of my background. I did a long master's degree in biblical studies and theology, so I have that background, and I trust the Bible as history, which kind of sets me at odds with a lot of my colleagues in the world of archaeology. You know, I went on to get, masters and doctorates in archaeology, and I have another one in hermeneutics. And so I'm an intensely biblical guy from a technical point of view, and but I also have the archaeological training, and I also have about 30 field seasons under my belt, with 17 seasons, 20 years now plus, dealing with the site of Sodom.
People, if they wanted to actually be a part of some of your digs, is it possible for people to join you?
Well, it has been up to last year. In 2023, we actually had our last season under my direction. Now, we might pick it up again later, but as you can tell from the visual here, I'm not getting any younger. And so I've got to publish. If you don't publish, you may as well never have excavated in the first place. We're now in the second year of a 10-year analysis and publication phase for our excavation. We're 20 years into the el-Hammam excavation project, and now we have, in essence, 8 more years to go. There's a lot to do. You know, we're running radiocarbon dates. We're analyzing the pottery. We're analyzing the objects. We're putting el-Hammam, really rewriting the history of the Southern Levant in the light of the discoveries at el-Hammam. So we have a lot of work to do. So we just had to draw a line in the sand and say, that's enough excavating. We have enough data. It'll take us 10 years to crunch it.
I think a lot of people might not be familiar with is the fact that when you dig a site, you, in a sense, destroy it because you take it apart. But then you record everything. You take, photography and drawings, correct? And then you have to publish that, right? Because you're the only person in the world, your team is the only people that have ever been allowed to dig that little spot, right?
No, that's exactly right. And photography, field drawings, Everything has to be. We have more paperwork than the IRS. I think it's like just like reams of paperwork for each individual square. The site of Tal el-Hammam is so large. It's the largest continuously occupied Bronze Age city in the entire southern Levant. And so it's just massive site. It could occupy our time for 1,000 years. 1,000 years, we'd never get it all excavated. But what we have done to this point is adequate enough for us to get a real good sense about what's there.
In Israel, they call things a tell, but in Jordan, they call it a tall, correct?
Yes, there's a slight variation in how you render the vowel. And so in Israel, in Hebrew, it's T-E-L, and in Arabic, it's T-E-L-L. But in Jordan, for some reason, they now favor, or have for the last 10 or 15 years, favored the ah and instead of the eh. But that's why I call it Tal el-Hammam. A lot of people want me to call it Tal al-Hammam, but I like preserving the eh for the L because it kind of gives us a sense of both pronunciations and kind of a little history there in the name. So, yeah, it's all the same thing. It's just a matter of a little bit of a regional variation in the vocalization.
So how did you come about deciding that this was an area that you would look at when it came to searching for the location of Sodom?
Well, I didn't start out looking for Sodom. I started out on this whole trek back in about 1996. Of course, we were always taking people on tours to Israel and Jordan and across the Near East. And I happened to be on the part of our itinerary where I was going to take our group over to Baba Dra and Numira, the sites on the southern Dead Sea area on the east side of the Rift Valley that a lot of people have said are Sodom and Gomorrah. By the way, I had been in a 1993 documentary that aired on CBS touting Baba Dra as Sodom. So I was right there. My mind was right there with everybody else. But the fact of the matter was, I found out that I hadn't really studied it in depth, and nobody else had really studied it in depth, or they would never have gone there. But anyway, so the night before I went over there, I got my Bible out, and I read all the Sodom passages. So I read everything from Genesis 12 to 19, and I got to the end of it, and I thought, wait a minute, I don't see anything in those passages that would locate Sodom at the south end of the Dead Sea. So I thought, well, maybe I'm sleepy. You ever done sleep driving or sleep reading? Where you just you're tired and you just kind of sail through something. Well, did I really read that? So I sat up in bed. I read that passage 4 more times. And at the end of it, I thought, you know what? There is nothing in this passage that would locate Sodom at the south end of the Dead Sea. In fact, everything about the passage locates Sodom north and east of the Dead Sea. I thought, well, we had just started our Khirbet el-Maqadir excavation up in the West Bank that year, and I wasn't looking for a project. But I said, someday, if I ever get bored, I'm going to come back to this because this is bugging me sufficiently that I had always believed something that wasn't true. I had embraced the conventional wisdom of everybody else, and all of a sudden I realized that this couldn't hold water. So I said, someday I'll come back to it. So we continue to excavate in the West Bank at the site we call a biblical eye, the Eye of Joshua. In 2000, that was our last season there. In that moment of time, because the Intifada got a little heated up in the West Bank, and so it became unsafe for us to excavate there. So we shut it down or put it on hold for a while. And so that winter, and that would be the winter of 2001, I'm thinking, wait a minute. I'm an archaeologist. I need a project. What am I going to do? Started feeling nervous. Oh, and then it came back to me. Oh, the Sodom issue. Now I have a little space in my life to kind of carve out some research and see where this goes. So I started. And so I put in to read a paper the next fall at the Near East Archaeological Society on the location of Sodom. Because I knew if I didn't put in to read an academic paper, I'd find all kinds of excuses. Life would get busy. I wouldn't do it. So I forced myself into that research by signing up to present a paper in November. So I did it. And it went to 10 pages, which is about typical. And then it went to 20, and then it went to 40, and then it went to 70. And it just got bigger and bigger and bigger. It was a massive undertaking, but I finally finished that. By the way, that became a little book that I wrote called The Search for Sodom and Gomorrah. And but this was all before we actually started excavating.
You were able to build quite a historical case then from this research that you kind of forced yourself. And I think, Dr. Collins, I think that's important for people to realize. If you have a sense of direction, you somewhat just need to move forward, right?
I mean, you need to jump, or you never do it unless you just, oh, I need to do this, let's do it. And you got to jump in, full body. You've got to go to it. You can't dink around on it. You've got to really commit to it. And I always do my research like this. I never want to know what anybody else thinks going in at the beginning. I want to take it from Scripture, from the Bible, by itself. I'm going to do a full, complete, word for word, phrase for phrase, textual analysis of the relevant passages involved. And that's what I did. So I didn't care at that point what other people thought. I wanted to know what the Bible says and where it would take me. And so we put together a theoretical map based on Genesis chapter 13. And by the way, that is the only primary geographical passage in Scripture for the location of Sodom. Every other thing that people allege, giving clues to the location of Sodom, no. This is the primary one, and all the others have to be interpreted in the light of this primary passage.
Let's talk about that chapter. What was it unique about that chapter? Why does that give us, in your mind, the direction for Sodom? What does it state?
Well, Genesis 13, 1-12 is what we call a map. It's a geographical map, actually written purposefully, consciously by the writer to take the reader to the location of Sodom. So that's exactly why it was written. So let's just run through the story. You remember Abraham had come into the land from Haran. He had pitched his tent on a hill between Bethel and Ai, and then he had gone down to Egypt, and he came back to that spot between Bethel and Ai where he had previously built an altar to Yahweh. And so where is he? He is 12 miles north of Jerusalem. He's between the city of Bethel and Ai. We know exactly where those cities are located, and that is north of Jerusalem. In fact, on a latitude, it's north of the Dead Sea. Abraham and Lot have a little difficulty. Lot comes to Abraham one day and he says, we have too many flocks, too many herds, too many people. We cannot occupy the same pasturage. We need to split up. And Abraham says, I think Abraham didn't like Lot very much, but I kind of get a sense. But he says, oh, great idea, Lot. And I tell you what, you go to the left, I'll go to the right. You pick a direction. I'll go the opposite direction. And of course, people criticize Lot for eventually taking the best land, but that's not what was happening here. He knew that God had given Abraham Canaan on the Cisjordan side, the west side of the river. This was Abraham's territory that God had given him. Lot looked up, and he lifted up his eyes, and he saw that the entire Kikar circle of the Jordan Valley was well watered, like the Garden of Eden, like the land of Egypt. So where is he? He's north of Jerusalem. He is north of the Dead Sea, and we excavated there for 6 years, so we know what you can see from there. You can see the entire circle of the Kikar of the Jordan. By the way, that's the word plain in most translations.
I know when you go there, you can really see it to this day. It just jumps out because it's this beautiful flat area that grows wonderful crops, I believe.
It really does. It's a wonderful kind of Garden of Eden place even today. So it says Lot looked over and saw this from where Abraham and he were standing. Where is that? Well, it's north of Jerusalem. And he looks over and he sees the Jordan Valley. And by the way, the word Jordan itself, Ha-Yarden, means the descending. The descending of what? The descending of the fresh water. So it's the fresh watershed that comes down all through that region, and all that fresh water flows into the Jordan River, and the Jordan River then goes down to the Dead Sea. And the Bible very clearly says that the Jordan ends at the Bay of the Dead Sea, at the mouth of the Jordan, below Pisgah, which is Nebo, which is right there at the north end of the Dead Sea. So that's the termination point. And I always tell people, do you suppose that high Yarden, the descending of the fresh water, would terminate when it hits the lowest spot on the face of the earth, which is the surface of the Dead Sea? Yes, you can't descend any further than that. So the ancient people have had a very clear concept of what the Jordan was.
So in your mind, that is an indicator that Sodom cannot be on the southern side of the Dead Sea, right? Is what you're saying?
Exactly, because the Dead Sea is in the Dead Sea Valley. It's a different part of the Rift Valley. The Jordan portion of the Rift Valley is the descending of the fresh water to the north of the Dead Sea. And so it says that Lot then lifted up his eyes, and he saw that the entire circle Kikar of the Jordan was well watered, and he then traveled eastward. Where is he? He's at Bethel-Ai. He travels eastward and pitches his tent ad Sedom, as far on the Kikar as he could go on the other side, toward Sodom. And so Lot travels eastward, pitches his tent at Sodom or toward Sodom or near Sodom, and the rest of the story, of course, unfolds from there. That was the map. The map that we drew showed it. And we knew, based on the settlement patterns and the dynamics of the Jordan River back in antiquity, that the cities of the plain had to be as far from the river as Jericho was on the other side, because the Jordan River would overflow its banks to several kilometers on each side in the spring every year. And so you couldn't have a city or a village or town that close to the river. And so you had to be up on the edge. That's exactly what the Bible says. Lot traveled eastward and pitched his tent as far as Sodom. He didn't go south. He didn't turn right. He didn't turn left. He went forward into the rising sun and pitched his tent as far as Sodom. So that's what took us to that location. We didn't know it was there. I'd been through that area, but I'd never walked it. I'd never read the archaeological studies and research and excavations that had been done in that area, which we eventually did. And when we found it, something really marvelous happened, because all the American scholars and the Israeli scholars, the European scholars had a blank. The northeast of the Dead Sea for the Bronze Age was a blank. And what we discovered when we began to do that research in Jordan, that there were 14 major archaeological sites in that cluster north and east of the Dead Sea. And the largest site in the entire Jordan Valley was sitting there, Tal el-Hammam. And of course, we had ascertained from the biblical text that Sodom was the largest and most important of the cities of the Kikar. So it wasn't really difficult to find it, because the Bible said it was the largest Bronze Age city north and east of the Dead Sea, and voila, there it was, staring us in the face.
What you're saying then is that because of the way archaeology has, developed, no one had really had an opportunity to be over there before. No.
In fact, that little episode that happened with Israel and the Arab nations back in 1967 and 1972 and 3, all that conflict, the site of Tal el-Hammam was landmined, and the landmines weren't removed until the mid-90s. So that kept everybody out. And so since then people have begun to look at it and to assess it, but it had never been excavated. And how do you not excavate the largest, most important Bronze Age ruin in the Jordan Valley? It's still a mystery to me why nobody ever really dove into that. But it was a no-brainer to us. This was the site of Sodom. That was our theory going in, and everything about the excavation confirmed it.
The Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin so grievous, that I will go down and see what they've done, as bad as the outcry. And so that then sort of sets up for this destruction, right? This mass destruction. And it says that the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from heaven. So when you went to that location to start the archaeology. What was the approach that you took, and were you looking for sulfur and something that came from heaven?
Well, let me say this: there is very ancient volcanic activity in the Jordan Valley, in the Dead Sea part of the Rift, but it's very ancient. It's thousands and thousands of years before mankind ever came to the region, and so the little sulfur balls were belched out with this volcanic activity, and they're found all over the Dead Sea area. They're everywhere. The problem is that sulfur is just a bad misnomer. It's bad translation. You have to remember that the book of Genesis was not written in Hebrew. Moses didn't know Hebrew. Hebrew didn't exist. The later Hebrew that we find, say, in the prophets and the other Iron Age literature was something that was contemporized over a long period of time. But Moses basically spoke the local dialect, Canaanite, and that's what the Hebrews spoke when they came into Canaan. They spoke Amorite or Canaanite. But these little documents that have to do with Abraham, these are probably actually deriving from the time of Abraham. These are eyewitness accounts written in the time of Abraham himself. And what was Abraham's native tongue? It was Akkadian. Hebrew didn't even exist during that period of time. And so it was a much later dialect that would develop. But Akkadian was the lingua franca of the world of Abraham, and it was so 1,000 years before him, and it was 1,000 years after him still. And so Akkadian is the central language. When we look at that passage, it says that two things came out of heaven. Goprit ba'esh, sulfur, ? And fire. But if you look at Goprit, what it actually means, as you chase it back in the Semitic cognates, particularly into Akkadian, it actually means burning stone. Burning stone or burning stones. And if you look at the translation of the Quran, which picks up on that story 15 times, in the Quran, the way they deal with the concept, they said God threw stones upon the evil cities. So they're even picking up the concept, even from seeing it in the Hebrew, coming over into equivalency in Arabic, that the whole thing is stones, burning stones. So it's not sulfur, it's burning stone. Now, when you think of burning stone and fire from Yahweh out of the heavens, what does that sound like? And so I look at some of the other theories that people have put forth. Oh, there was some kind of a volcano, or there was some kind of natural gas being belched out in an earthquake and set on fire, and the plume fell down on the cities. This is geological nonsense. There's no geologist who would seriously put that forward. And the text is very crisp and clear. This destruction came out of the heavens. It is a cosmic event, pure and simple, and it's burning stone and fire. Well, when you talk about burning stone and fire, we don't have to think too hard about that. We know of meteoritic events like asteroids and comet fragments and things like that that come in and even create in the past geology of the Earth massive extinction events. This is a cosmic airburst event, pure and simple. And we thought that early on. In fact, we even included a chapter on airburst phenomena in our little book, Search for Sodom and Gomorrah, before we ever began to excavate. And by the way, that's an important little piece of information, because as the 16 seasons of excavation moved forward, in the last 6 or 7 seasons, we had an entire team, independent of our team, and an independent team of scientists, astrophysicists, physical scientists, some archaeologists. 21 different scientists from all over the world converged on el-Hammam in terms of making it the focus of a particular study that they did. They took samples. I mean, they spent a lot of their own money pulling this stuff out. And of course, we had a very specific sampling protocol. You have to do the science rigorously. And here's what they came up with. In 2021, they published in one of the most prestigious scientific journals on the planet, Nature Scientific Reports, this fabulous long article, 60 some odd pages long, that a Tunguska-sized airburst event happened over Tal el-Hammam, a Middle Bronze Age city in the southern Levant. By the way, that is now the most downloaded scientific paper in the history of the internet. Most scientific papers are downloaded maybe by a few hundred people. That particular paper has been downloaded almost 700,000 times, almost 750,000 downloads. And the follow-on paper, which was published in Open Science, this was just like this last year, already has 65,000 downloads. And so this thing has really taken off.
What you're saying, because I remember reading articles about this, and it seemed as if there was like a nuclear blast, right?
The heat index, some of the dynamics in the heat index caused by a meteoritic airburst event equals or exceeds that which happens in a nuclear explosion. We're talking about tens of thousands of degrees Fahrenheit. We found evidences across the site: melted plaster, melted mud bricks, melted pottery. In some of the melted pottery, we actually, through scanning electron microscopes, saw, and when I say we, I mean this kind of analysis is way past my pay grade. I'm talking about the scientists who actually did it. What they saw was melted zircons and boiled zircons. A zircon boils at almost 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It's actually an element, zirconium. And it's like a diamond, only not quite that hard. And I mean, how do you boil a zirconium at 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit? And not only that, but some of the surface melt on the pottery, this greenish glass that forms, shows that the temperature of the blast lasted about that long. Because if it lasted any longer, like 3, 4, 5 seconds, the entire piece of pottery or brick or whatever it was would have been melted into a puddle.
It was almost like a flash in a camera.
It's like a nuclear sunburn. It's like superheat for just a very blink of an eye. And this is what happens. Meteoritic airburst, bolide airburst science is now a big deal. It's well understood. The dynamics are well understood. But what's interesting is that if you read Genesis 19, it says that God destroyed Sodom and the cities of the plain and the vegetation and the soil.
Did that burst actually cover that area then, that large of an area?
Yeah, it's about 400 square kilometers worth. It literally took out the entire southern Jordan Valley. By the way, all the cities in that area went offline at the same time toward the end of the Middle Bronze II period. And of course, putting Abraham in the right period of time is important. I had always said, if we could find the city of Sodom and get a good set of radiocarbon dates on the destruction of that city, we could nail the proper time frame for Abraham. And that's very, very important, by the way, because a lot of people don't know this. And what I find is a lot of people that talk about Sodom, they don't know the archaeology. They're not familiar with the details of the archaeology. Let me give you a couple of examples. One, a lot of people make Baba Drah and Numirah Sodom and Gomorrah. Baba Drah was destroyed in 2500 BC. Numirah was destroyed at least 100 years earlier than that. They were not even destroyed at the same time. And of course, they were both destroyed 5, 6, 7, 8 centuries, depending upon how you date Abraham, before the time of Abraham. So nobody has ever suggested in the actual real archaeological world, no one has ever suggested that those cities could ever have possibly been associated with the time of Abraham. It's just evangelicals that don't know what they're talking about, who just go and grab this stuff and think they know, but they don't. And so, well, what about Walt Rast and Tom Schaub, who actually excavated Baba Drah? Didn't he talk about Sodom? Yes. But his view was that the Sodom tale was not historical. It was an etiological legend based on the destruction, the ruin of Babadra. Albright never thought that these cities could be. By the way, there's only two cities. There's Babadra and Numera. Fifa, Safi, and Canazir are cemeteries only with no associated settlements. All the stuff about the southern end of the Dead Sea, let me say it this way, there isn't a single site in the southern Dead Sea area that could possibly, prayerfully, in any way be associated with the time of Abraham, which is the 18th century BC.
And that's the question, is the timing of the relationship of the Exodus and Abraham. How do you see the chronology for all that then? When I've talked to some of other people, I think they said that the time that this location was destroyed is too late in history.
Because most people put Abraham in the 21st, 22nd century BC. Here's how to solve this. Look at the archaeology. Not a single town mentioned in the Abrahamic narrative, including the city of Jerusalem, not a single town in the Abraham narrative was occupied between 2500 BC and 1800 BC. Period. The highland sites were completely out of business and completely without inhabitants and abandoned from 2500 BC, the collapse of the early Bronze Age, down to the time of the beginning of the Middle Bronze II in about 1800 BC. So Abraham has to be post-1800, or you don't have Hebron, you don't have Dan, you don't have Damascus, you don't have Shechem, you don't have any of the towns mentioned in the patriarchal narratives between 2500 and 1800 BC. And that's archaeologically, end of the discussion. Those are archaeological facts that everybody knows, or some people maybe don't know, or some people ignore, but you can't ignore it because Abraham belongs, and of course Kenneth Kitchen knew this, W.F. Albright knew this, Abraham belongs to the Middle Bronze II period between 1800 and 1600 BC.
And then the Exodus would be at 1450.
No, here's the problem. The use of numbers in the Torah are lifespans, for example, in the book of Genesis, a lifespan of Moses even. These are honorific formulas. They are not literal lifespan numbers. And it's very clear this is the way ancient Near Eastern people did this. The Egyptians did it. The Mesopotamians did it. Abraham's a Mesopotamian. So we can't go number crunching from the numbers given in Torah to try to make some kind of chronology out of this. We have to use historical synchronisms to identify the time of the Exodus, for example. Of course, my book, Let My People Go, I think it's right. It connects the time of the Exodus with the collapse of the great 18th dynasty, which happened around the beginning of the 14th century BC, around 1400. So the early date for the Exodus, 1446, is seriously problematic for a whole number of reasons.
Dr. Stephen, you're saying that you think the Exodus then happened more around 1400, but not the 1250 Ramesses Exodus date.
Right. No, I'm not a late dater, because you have to always ask the right question when you're doing research, and I find that a lot of archaeologists and Bible scholars are terrible with this. They don't ask the right question. If you don't ask the right questions, you won't come up with the appropriate answers. Here's the question about the Exodus. If all the terrible things that happened to Egypt around the time of the Exodus actually occurred as the Bible describes them, what would have happened to the dynasty, to the ruling dynasty at that moment? It would have collapsed. So the only place that you can place the Exodus events is in a dynastic collapse. Well, in the 200 years of time proposed by people from the mid-15th century BC to the mid-13th century BC for the Exodus, there's only one dynastic collapse, period. That happens with the collapse of the 18th dynasty, which began with the death of Thutmose IV. There's a high, middle, and low Egyptian chronology, and his death ranges from 1416 to 1386. So I think 1406 is a good date for it. By the way, that's the Septuagint date. Septuagint date for the Exodus is 1406, not, if you use the literal numbers, not 1446.
One thing I want to try to do in the future is get back to these very same questions, do another patterns film on just the whole chronology. We all wonder what happened, right? And how, where did it happen and how did it happen?
By the way, I would say Read my book, Let My People Go. That will give it to you. The collapse of the 18th dynasty is what happened in response to the Exodus. All those terrible things that happened to Egypt. The 18th dynasty collapsed and nobody ever knew why. Well, we know why. And I mean, we're talking about plagues. I mean, this is all documented in the Egyptian records. Plagues and, what the Hittites are doing and what other kingdoms are doing. And Egypt goes from having a great empire to having no empire overnight. And what happened?